Welcome to the second of our lectures today on visual culture and Japan's modern history. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the time period known as wartime Japan. And please note the dates that I provide here from 1931 until 1945. This, I think, is a very important starting point in trying to understand wartime Japan and the aims of Japan's engagement with war, not only in Asia, but also with the United States. The Japanese today often refer to this war as the 15-year war, lasting from 1931 until 1945. In 1931, Japan invaded northeast China, known as Manchuria, and that was in September of 1931. And then almost 15 years later, in August of 1945, Japan surrendered on August 15th, a mere 10 days or almost 10 days after the dropping of two atomic bombs, the first on Hiroshima on August 6th, and the second on Nagasaki on August 9th. So from the Japanese perspective, World War II began in 1931, and I think this is very important. All too often we try to understand World War II as a war that started in 1939 and lasted until 1945. But I would argue that that is leaving out large parts of the world. And if we really want to treat World War II as a global conflict, then we need to include the war in Asia as an important element of World War II. And that war in Asia began in 1931. So what I want to try to do in this lecture is to explore the motivations for Japanese leaders, the Japanese government, the Japanese military, Japanese cultural figures to engage in war in in Asia and also against the United States. I think all too often when we think about why Japan was fighting this war, we're inheriting a very simplistic understanding that emerged from the wartime era itself, particularly the wartime era in the United States and the Pacific War between Japan and the United States lasting from 1941 until 1945. And during that era, the simple explanation was that Japan was fighting this war in order to dominate the world. And I don't think necessarily that that explanation is wrong. It's just incomplete. And it's too simplistic. And I think it really doesn't give you a sense of why, from the Japanese perspective, they were fighting this war. So that's what I really want to try to focus our lecture on today, and to try to raise some issues that hopefully we can continue to discuss on October 31st. So the first question I want to pose was, who was Japan's enemy during the wartime era? And I think enemy, singular, is the wrong way to think about it. There were, in fact, enemies, plural, and I've listed a number of them here. One, obviously, the United States was Japan's enemy. They were Japan's military enemy from 1941 until 1945. But that's not the only reason Japan was fighting this war. Their other enemy was Western imperialism and the Western presence in Asia that dated back centuries. Much of the rhetoric that was justifying Japan's war in Asia, which began in 1931, was to expel Westerners from Asia and to create what was called Asia for the Asians. So another enemy of Japan was Western imperialism. A further enemy was Western culture, the Western culture that we saw in the previous lecture that began to take root in Japan during the late 19th century. By the middle of the 20th century, or at least by the 1930s and early 1940s, there began to be an effort to expel Western culture from Japan and Asia and to replace it with Asian and Japanese culture that was equally modern to Western culture, yet distinctly different. And different in the sense that it was rooted in Asian history, Asian culture, Asian values, and Asian aesthetics. And ultimately, then, this leads us to think about perhaps the fourth enemy that Japan was fighting against, and that's the Enlightenment, the European intellectual movement from the 1700s that began to try to sketch out a path to becoming modern. And that path to becoming modern, according to Enlightenment thinkers, was through following natural laws that followed reason and rationality and scorned superstition and religion. But even more broadly, what the Enlightenment thinkers began to argue was that Europe was the home of the modern, and that the path to becoming modern had to lead through Europe, that it had to lead through the Western example. And this was an idea that ultimately Japanese wartime leaders were fighting against, because they were fighting to expel Western imperialism and to expel Western culture. And in its place, what they wanted to insert and champion and develop was a culture that was both modern and Asian. And they're challenging this Enlightenment idea that the only path to the modern leads through the Western example. And they began to argue that there were multiple paths to becoming modern, that there was an Asian path to becoming modern, and that Japan and other Asian countries no longer needed to be subordinated to the Western example in order to become modern. So a final enemy then Japan is fighting against is this very Enlightenment idea that there was a single path to becoming modern, and that path was following the Western example. Japan wanted to prove to itself and to the world that that Enlightenment ideal was incorrect. Okay, so let's look at Japanese propaganda, Japanese explanations for their wartime motivations, and particularly I want to try to root it in visual culture. And so I'm going to draw upon political cartoons, political posters, animated cartoons, a whole series of elements of popular culture that represent very clearly why Japan was fighting this war. So first of all, we want to start out with one of Japan's main enemies, which was the United States, with whom they were at war from December 1941 until August 1945 in what is known as the Pacific War. And the enemy here was often represented in the form of the leader of the United States, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And here we begin to see consistent images of FDR that represent how Japan understood their enemy. FDR was often represented as a powerful but evil, monstrous-like figure. And you can see, for instance, in this image on the left, the beginnings of that transformation with his teeth. Here, his claw-like hands. Here, and the sinister look of his eyes. Here on the right, we have a somewhat grainy image, but of a political cartoon that shows FDR's human mask being removed. And then what's behind is, again, this evil but powerful, monstrous-like figure. I think we get a much clearer sense of who the American enemy was from a different political cartoon of FDR. And this is an image that really closely associates America as the enemy with American military power and technological prowess. If you look closely, you can see that FDR's eyebrows and nose are cannons. His teeth are bullets. He has, I guess you could call them airplane wrinkles on his face. His hair is battleships. So this represents this idea that the United States was undeniably a powerful enemy. They were a technologically sophisticated enemy, yet they were at the same time using that technological sophistication for evil ends. And that ends was world domination, and in particular, the suppression of Japan. And this is not necessarily a new image of the United States held by Japanese. If we go back to what we talked a little bit about in the first lecture, the coming of Matthew Perry to Japan, you can see that the view of Perry, and more broadly the United States at that time, was very similar to FDR. He had an elongated nose, sinister eyes, and if you go back and forth, you can see some of these similarities. And once again, the source of both American power but also American evil was technology. And here again, this is not new. You can go back to the time of Perry and see the representations of his ships, the famous black ships, the smoke-belching coal-powered ships, as these intimidating emblems of Western technology. So in some ways, the enemy that Japan was fighting during the Pacific War was not simply a new enemy. It was an old enemy. It was a long-term battle against the United States and more broadly against Western domination and Western hegemony over Japan. So this is one enemy that Japan was fighting. Now let's begin to consider some of those other enemies by thinking about the war from Japan's perspective, and specifically thinking about the motivations for war. Who were they fighting against, and why were they fighting against those people? And as I said, we're going to draw on visual culture as broadly as possible, including, as you can see in this image, a children's magazine. This was a children's magazine from the wartime era that's giving a visual representation of Asia, and it's giving a representation of why Japan was fighting. And this is a wonderful image to have students really look at closely and try to decode, because there's a lot of different elements that I think are worthy of our, and particularly your students' attention. One of them is obvious. This is the enemies of the United States and Great Britain and other Western powers. You can see them represented here and here as these people who, as these political leaders who hail from the technologically advanced West, coming to oppress Asian peoples. And what you can see throughout this map is images of Japanese making alliances with the local Asian peoples. So there's this idea then that Japan is beginning to forge unions with and alliances with other Asian peoples to carry out a joint mission. And that joint mission is the expulsion of the Western powers, which you can see, for instance, occurring over here, all the way over in India. You see different Asian peoples beginning to make the person from England flee the Indian subcontinent. So this kind of image begins to suggest that Japan was not just fighting against the United States, but they were fighting in Asia, starting back in 1931, in order to liberate Asia from Western control. That was one of the main goals of Japan's war beginning in 1931. This idea of the Japanese as liberators was clear in the image that we just saw, and I think even clearer and perhaps even in a more complex way in this image. Now, obviously, the idea of pushing out the Westerners is clear in this image. This is an image of a Dutch person being pushed out by the sun, which is representative of Japan, the Japan bringing enlightenment to, in this case, Southeast Asia. But I think what's interesting in this image, which was absent in the one before, is what's going on right here. Because even though Japan was advertising themselves as the liberators and as the force behind unity among all Asian peoples, that didn't mean that the Japanese abandoned notions of hierarchy, a theme that we visited in the first lecture. But they didn't abandon those notions of hierarchy even amidst their battles in Asia beginning in 1931. So here, I think some things to really draw your attention to is the light-skinned coloration of the Japanese hand and then the dark-skinned coloration of the people of Southeast Asia. There's also a contrast between what seems to be a kind of modern garb worn by the Japanese individual and then the garb of a worker. And so this image is suggesting that even though it's an image of fraternity, it's not necessarily an image of equality. That Japan still sees itself as the leader of Asia, and they are the ones who are going to direct Asian peoples toward a new future. So this image, I think, is really quite evocative of the complexities of Japan's motivations for war and what they were trying to accomplish by going to war in Asia in 1931. But this theme of liberation was not just limited, I think, to East Asia, and this is another important idea that Japan and Japanese leaders imagined expelling Europeans from all of Asia, including as far away as India. So you began to see propaganda posters produced by the Japanese suggesting a kind of racial unity between a Japanese soldier here and Indian peoples as they kick out the British, who, after all, as it makes clear in this bottom image, are only in India to steal money and to become rich. So the Japanese motivations for war in terms of expelling Western imperialism were quite broad and quite ambitious. And I think that becomes clear when you realize that they intended to try to go as far as India to enlist Indians to aid this goal of kicking Westerners out from Asia. Alongside this desire to expel Westerners and Western imperialism from Asia was a desire to replace it with something that was often referred to as the New Order. And the New Order in East Asia was captured by a wartime propaganda slogan known as the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which you can see as represented in this image on the left. Because one of the things this image is trying to make clear is that, number one, in creating the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, there's a recognition of racial unity as Asian peoples that unites all of these people together. But at the same time, alongside that racial unity was an acknowledgement and even an embrace of ethnic difference. And so you see all of the different ethnicities and peoples of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere being represented here together. But as this wartime propaganda slogan makes clear, the hope was to unite all Asian peoples together and to work together to realize prosperity for all. This was the beginning then of a wartime dream in Japan. This was a motivation for war. It's the twin in some ways of the motivation to expel Western imperialism from Asia. Coupled with that then was a desire to build in Asia this co-prosperity sphere. And as this image indicates, and as this series of image indicates as well, children were often mobilized in propaganda posters. These are children that, as you can see here, are working together, particularly in this middle image, to create Asian unity and to bring, if you look up here, peace to Asia. Yet at the same time, this project of creating Asian fraternity was not a project necessarily of assimilation. And this is one of the ways that many scholars argue Japanese imperialism in Asia during the wartime era differed from Western imperialism. In the case of Western imperialism, the overwhelming rhetoric suggested that the relationship between the mother country and the colonies was one that was captured in this idea of the civilizing mission, that Western nations were present in places in Africa and Asia in order to civilize these people and to teach them how to be civilized. In short, to teach them how to be more European. So there's a very strong assimilationist impulse in Western imperialism that scholars of Japanese imperialism, while arguing that assimilationist impulse was not entirely absent, at the same time, it was nowhere near as strong as it was in the Western case. In its place then, in place of this assimilationist impulse, was this impulse to build what is referred to here as a multi-ethnic empire, where the Japanese unite together people of different ethnicities, different regions of Asia together to get people to work towards the same goal, towards this creating this brighter, prosperous future. And I think that's one of the reasons why children were often mobilized in these images, because they represented hope for the future. They represented the possibility of a different future. And that's what Japan was fighting for. They wanted to create a future for Asia of racial unity, co-prosperity, and finally, the absence of Western domination. Now, the absence of Western domination meant not only kicking out the actual Western imperialists themselves, the people, the human beings, but it also meant purging Japan and Asia of Western influence, and particularly Western culture and Western values. And you see that, for instance, in this image on the top here. This is an image of a Japanese woman who is combing from her hair what is referred to in the text, which is almost impossible to see, as Anglo-American ideals. She's combing from her hair then these ideals which are represented in Japanese characters here, ideals such as selfishness, liberalism, individualism, money worship, materialism. These were the values that Japan was trying to rid itself of. And the key idea here was an idea of purification. That the Japanese were fighting this war to purify themselves and to purify Asia of Western influence. Now, in this bottom cartoon, you see probably the most famous wartime slogan Zeitaku wa teki da, or luxury is the enemy. And luxury was believed to be an Anglo-American ideal that had infected Japan and had become the enemy that needed to be defeated. So when we get back to this larger idea of who was the enemy or who were the enemies Japan was fighting against, it's the United States, it's Western imperialism, but it's also Western culture as well. And one of the, I think, most interesting images of Japan's battle against Western culture is their battle to expel American culture and American influence in Japan. And you begin to see this in Japanese propaganda films appearing as early as 1936. There was a famous one called Evil Mickey Attacks Japan, and it's a battle between Mickey Mouse, representing American culture, and Momotaro, the Japanese peach boy, representing Japanese culture. And I've provided for you in the PowerPoint that will be sent to you a link to this animated cartoon. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long, and it'd be interesting way for your students to understand the Japanese battle against Western culture and the Japanese battle to not just expel American culture, but to replace it with a revived and strengthened Japanese culture that's represented here by the figure of Momotaro. So perhaps we can talk about this animated cartoon in the meeting on October 31st if we have time. So by all means, try to give it a watch and see what you think about this Japanese propaganda film. So there was this effort to fight the enemy of Western culture. So then the question becomes then, what do you do with all this Western culture? Because Western culture had become part of Japan dating back to the middle of the 1800s. So what we're talking about here simply turning back the clock? And the answer is no. And I think you can see this when you consider the wartime debates about what to do with Western culture. For instance, what to do with the presence of dance halls or jazz music. These were seen as quintessentially Western cultural forms, and the wartime debate made clear what needed to be done with them. So on the one hand, you had to remove the Western versions of modern culture. So this is interesting. Japanese thinkers began to argue that it wasn't just Western culture, that there was something called modern culture, and then there was a Western version of that. So what needed to be done was to remove the Western versions of modern culture. So here's a quote from the wartime years. The existence of dance halls and dance schools rebel against our national conditions, disturb womanhood, encourage frivolity in our youth, and exert not a little bad influence on the nation's public morality. So you needed to get rid of these Western versions of modern culture, and at the same time, you need to create Japanese versions of modern culture. And here we're starting to see the fourth enemy that Japan is fighting against, this Enlightenment idea that modern culture is, by its very definition, Western culture. And what the Japanese are beginning to do as part of the wartime effort is to reject that formulation and to assert that there is something called modern culture, and Westerners realized a version of modern culture, but that's a Western version. And that what we need to do as we get rid of Western versions of modern culture from Japan and Asia, we need to replace those versions of modern culture with our own versions of modern culture. So here's another quotation from the wartime era. That is, our present mission as a people is to build up a new Japanese culture by adopting and sublimating Western cultures within our national polity as the basis, and to contribute spontaneously to the advancement of world culture. So there is obviously an acknowledgement that many forms of modern culture enter Japan via Western culture, but that it doesn't always need to remain that way. And for instance, one of the things that a scholar has written a whole book about is the effort during the wartime era to come up with a Japanese form of jazz music. So the argument was that jazz music itself was modern, and that there was a Western version of it and an American version, but that there could also be a Japanese version. And this is what I mean by arguing that Japanese leaders were fighting to create Japanese versions of modern culture. So, as an example of the kind of thinking that I was just describing, let's look at the search for an Asian-style chair that occurred during Japan's wartime era. Now, according to the thinking that I just described, the idea of a chair was itself modern. But that didn't necessarily mean that there was only one version of a chair. What Japanese activists argued was that there were Western versions of chairs, but then there could also be Asian versions of chairs, an Asian-style chair. So from one of the leaders of this movement to develop an Asian-style chair, we have this quotation that said, "Japan must have Japanese chairs, and by extension, there must be Asian chairs. Is it acceptable then that products continue indefinitely to be second or even third-rate inferior imitations of European chairs? We must advance to reform not only chairs, but also desks and shelves, and indeed, the entire space of daily life." So there was this push then to develop a material culture of daily life that was both modern and Asian at the same time. So this new culture of daily life was going to be built by Asian hands, built with Asian materials, and built according to Asian style. But it was going to be, according to these activists, undeniably modern, and yet at the same time, undeniably Asian. And this is where a lot of the experimental reform movement to create a new culture of daily life occurred. And that was in the colonies, in fact. Asia was seen as a laboratory for reform that will inform change within Japan. And this is one of the, I think, distinct elements of Japanese imperialism that you don't see as much in Western imperialism. And that is to say, many Japanese leaders looked to the Asian colonies as a source of national rejuvenation, as a place through which Japan could reclaim its attachment to its Asian roots. They argued that ever since the Meiji era, Japan had become too westernized, and that the only way for them to rid themselves of Western culture and to reconnect with their Asian culture was to seek to deepen their relationship with their colonies in Asia. Those colonies had not been as excessively westernized as Japan, and hence they served as storehouses of an Asian spirit that Japan had perhaps lost touch with. So these colonies, they're not just being seen as a place that needed to be assimilated into Japanese culture, where the people there had to live exactly like Japanese. That was the European civilizing mission model. And then while it did exist to a certain extent in Japanese imperialism, there was also this different strain of thinking that the colonies were going to serve as a source of national rejuvenation in Japan, and that the colonies were this laboratory for reform where the Asian spirit was excavated, Asian style, Asian taste, Asian values were excavated and then worked on by Japanese leaders as well as Asian peoples to create a new culture of daily life that was both Asian and modern. So to summarize what I've been covering so far, Japan's wartime years were arguably motivated by an attempt to overcome Western influence and to build a new modern world in East Asia. And the key points that I've been trying to get across here, this idea of renovating Asia meant that Japan wanted to expel Western peoples, Western power, and Western culture from Asia, and then to strengthen Japan through its connection with the primal spirit of Asia, which was to be found in its colonies. Japan then would help to guide Asia to a new form of the modern that valued things such as autonomy, prosperity, and fraternity among multi-ethnic peoples, and then ultimately to realize a project and a mission that they argued was anti-imperialist and anti-enlightenment. Now, to try to pull a lot of these themes together, I've sent along to you an excerpt from an essay written by a Japanese author, Tanizaki Junichiro, in 1933. The book is called In Praise of Shadows. And in some ways, when you start reading it, you'll wonder, what does this book have to do with Japanese wartime motivations? But I think the more you read it, and I've only given you about 10 or 11 pages, you'll see that Tanizaki's book is an exploration of the Japanese search for an East Asian modern, and an explanation of the need for an Asian modernity to be realized. So I hope you enjoy that, and I think we can talk about it during our meeting on October 31st. Now what I want to do in the final few minutes of this lecture is to focus our attention on what the war looked like from the American perspective, and particularly what the war looked like from the American perspective on their Japanese enemy. So we want to think a little bit about race and the war from the American perspective. So now on to our final theme, captured in this question here. Who was the Japanese enemy from the American perspective? We spent a lot of time thinking about who were the enemies from the Japanese perspective, and now we want to slightly switch our perspective and focus on the American side, and particularly their views of their Japanese enemy. And here, once again, we're going to draw on visual culture, political cartoons, propaganda posters, animated cartoons, but we're also going to try to introduce a new theme, race and racial motivations for fighting the war against Japan. This is a theme that scholars have developed over the past really 2 to 3 decades as a crucial but often overlooked element of the war. And I think it will tie into your later part of the workshop on Japanese American internment. So let's begin to think about race and American views of the Japanese enemy by looking at some images of the Japanese enemy from the wartime era. Here we have a poster saying Alaska, death trap for the Jap. So the idea is that if the Japanese decided to invade Alaska, they would find it to be a death trap. But what's of interest here is how the Japanese enemy is being portrayed. Not as a human, but as a rat, as something that needed to be exterminated. And this is a very common theme in American propaganda during the wartime years. The not only dehumanization of the Japanese enemy, but the depiction of the Japanese enemy as animals, as being in animal form. Rats were very common, and also monkeys. Here's an image from the cover of Time magazine, which is depicting the monkey men, Japanese soldiers, making their way through the jungles of Southeast Asia. And so this idea of the Japanese as monkey men obviously is drawing on Darwinian scientific theory, the idea that monkeys are, in evolutionary terms, not as evolved as humans, and this reflected the American belief that the Japanese as a people were not fully evolved either. and hence we have Westerners using Western science, invoking Western science in order to depict their enemy as something less than fully human. Now, obviously, Japan won a number of battles, especially in the beginning part of the war, late 1941, early to mid 1942. And this shocked Westerners, but it didn't necessarily change the way that they depicted their Japanese enemy. Here we see, once again, an image of a tough Japanese, but an image of a Japanese that, once again, is not human. This is a kind of King Kong-like figure. So the Japanese still remain in the form of being monkeys. And many scholars argue that this depiction of the Japanese as monkeys and as rats was not only part of the dehumanization that is a part of modern war, but it was also very much closely tied to an American motivation to fight the war. And that is to say, to put the Japanese back in their proper racial place. And this place was in a subordinate position to the fully evolved Americans and Europeans. So they're invoking this image of the Japanese as animals to construct or perhaps reconstruct a racial hierarchy that appealed to them, one in which the Japanese were in a subordinate position and the Americans were in the superior position. In addition to these animal-like images of the Japanese, there was images of the Japanese as scary, but also comical. And there's some particular facial features that you see represented time and time again in poster images of the Japanese, in animated cartoon images of the Japanese. Here you see it most clearly on the right, the Japanese needing to wear glasses, the Japanese having large, almost buck teeth, a kind of pug nose. This was a kind of comical version of a human being, but it was also, you can see here, very similar facial traits being invoked. The large teeth, the kind of pug nose, in a version that is the scary Japanese. So in addition to the animal-like imagery of the Japanese, you have the comical image of the Japanese, someone to be laughed at, and you have the scary image of the Japanese, someone to be feared. And there's a number of other themes that begin to emerge and reemerge throughout American propaganda. One of them focuses on the Japanese alliance with the Nazis and the idea that Japan and Hitler are in close cooperation to divide up the world based upon their signing of the Tripartite Pact with Italy in 1940. There's also images of Japanese men assaulting American women. We see that very clearly in this image here. And this is an image that's meant to invoke the fear and the menace of Japan, that its dastardly evil men were coming to take American women. And this is something that American soldiers needed to fight to prevent from happening. And then another image, which I'll talk about in a minute, that comes up is the ambiguous place of Japanese Americans. So here we see a series of images of different types of Japanese people depicted. I think this is Time magazine from September 1942. Here we have the Emperor of Japan. And these are really the prototypical Japanese figures in the American imagination. There's the Japanese soldier, again with the large teeth and the kind of pug nose and the glasses. Then there's Japanese military leaders. There's Japanese industrialists. There's the Japanese elderly, the Japanese businessman, the geisha, and then the worker. But nonetheless, what these images are trying to invoke is, again, this mixture of both comedy. It's almost comedic that the Japanese would imagine that they could take on the United States and defeat them, but at the same time, fear and fright that the Japanese were fighting as hard as they could to try to defeat their Western enemy and to begin to dominate the world. Now, one of the things that's very interesting during the wartime era is that all sorts of people are mobilized for war, including, in this instance, Dr. Seuss, Theodor Geisel. I believe this was before he was known as Dr. Seuss, but he was a very prolific political cartoonist during this time period. And you can see in some of his images here, him echoing this fixation on the Japanese marriage to Hitler, married exactly 1 year today, giving birth to a child, a Hashimura Frankenstein. So this image suggesting that Japan and the Nazis are intent on this global domination. And here it comes back to this theme of the Japanese Americans. And Dr. Seuss is suggesting that the Japanese Americans in California and Oregon and Washington are lining up to get their dynamite, and they're waiting for the signal from home to light the dynamite and to begin to assault their American enemy. So this kind of image isn't just depicting Japanese as the enemy of Americans, but Japanese Americans as the enemy as well. And this will clearly tie into your later discussion in the workshop. And finally, what I have here is a link to a number of cartoons. You'll have this in the PowerPoint that I send to you, just to give you some material that you might share with your students and that might be a hit with your students. Animated cartoons were swept up in the wartime years in the United States. Superman fights the Japanese, Donald Duck fights the Japanese, and a character named Tokyo Jokyo fights the Japanese. And so I've given you links to a series of relatively brief 6 to 8 minute cartoons that your students could watch and then dissect for their meaning. So that takes us to the end of our time, but I very much look forward to seeing all of you on the 31st and to continue talking about Japan's Meiji era, Japan's wartime era, visual culture, the theme of negotiating global hierarchies during the Meiji era, and really, in some ways, challenging global hierarchies during the wartime era. So I'll see you all on the 31st, and I'm looking forward to it.